Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was upon a particularly dismal November evening that I found myself once more in the familiar sitting room at 221B Baker Street. The air was thick with a damp fog which clung to the windows like a ghostly veil, and the street lamps beyond cast only the faintest pools of wan light upon the pavement below. The scent of rain, soot, and distant wood smoke drifted in with each creak of the window frame. Beside the hearth, Sherlock Holmes sat in uncharacteristic silence, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze lost somewhere in the swirling tendrils of his own cigarette smoke. There was about my friend that evening a certain restlessness, a rare abstraction that suggested his formidable mind was grappling with a problem yet unspoken. Upon the table lay a scattering of books, all concerning medieval architecture and the history of England's ecclesiastical ruins. Among them, I noticed a monograph dedicated solely to the design of concealed crypts and hidden reliquaries beneath cathedrals of the 14th and 15th centuries. I ventured to ask whether some particular case had drawn his interest to such a niche topic, but Holmes merely waved a languid hand and muttered something about the nature of obsession before lapsing once more into his own thoughts, leaving me none the wiser, and all the more curious. Our shared silence was broken at last by the firm knock of Mrs. Hudson upon the door, followed by her voice, pitched half in curiosity, half in unease, announcing the arrival of a visitor. The figure who entered cut a singular and unsettling form. Tall, wrapped entirely in a long black cloak, the edges of which dripped rainwater onto the floor. His hat was low upon his brow, and his gloved hand trembled visibly against the frame. Even before the man spoke, I saw Holmes's keen eyes flash with interest, for nothing attracts Sherlock Holmes quite like a man burdened by fear. Holmes did not wait for an introduction. He took in the man's muddy hem, the flecks of plaster clinging to his sleeve, and the faint yellowed ink staining his right thumb. And with the careless ease of a conjurer producing a rabbit from a hat, he announced, "You have just returned from Canterbury. You are, I gather, a man of scholarly pursuits, though your recent experiences seem to have involved more dust and earth than parchment. And as for your present agitation, I can only assume you have seen something within the walls of the Black Cathedral which you would much rather forget." The man's jaw slackened, his face losing what little colour it retained, and for a moment I feared he might collapse entirely. Holmes, for his part, merely smiled, the smile of a man who has plucked the thread from the tangled knot and already begun to unravel it. Holmes gestured the man to a chair with the easy authority of one accustomed to obedience, and the poor fellow sank into it as though his knees could no longer bear his weight. From his inner pocket, Holmes produced his battered cigarette case, offering it with a brief glance that seemed to strip away all pretense of formality between them. "You may speak," Holmes said quietly, "or you may sit in silence until the weight of your discovery compels you to do so. Either way, we shall arrive at the truth." The man's hand shook so violently that he could scarcely light the offered cigarette. I could not help but pity him. Yet Holmes's gaze was as cold and clinical as if he were observing a new species beneath a magnifying glass. "What?" Holmes said softly. "Precisely did you see beneath the stones of the Black Cathedral?" The man dropped his gaze to the floor and began to speak. The man who sat before us, still shivering despite the warmth of the fire, introduced himself as Mr. Alaric Penrose, a historian, though in that moment he seemed more like a man who had unearthed his own grave. His thin face was drawn and pale, his fingers ceaselessly worrying the brim of his hat, which he twisted with nervous energy. He explained that his present occupation had taken him to Canterbury, where he had been engaged to catalogue ancient relics housed within the Black Cathedral. The name stirred no recollection in me, but Holmes's eyes brightened ever so slightly. Penrose hesitated before continuing, his voice trembling with a weight that had nothing to do with the chill November air. The Black Cathedral, as Penrose explained, had long since been closed to the public. Its origins were draped in obscurity, and its decay had been left undisturbed for over a century. It was believed to be nothing more than a collapsing relic, its stones worn smooth by the tread of forgotten feet, its crypts sealed beneath the weight of time itself. Yet Penrose's survey had uncovered far more than relics. In the shadowed nave, beneath a shattered window, they found a grave, freshly disturbed, its edges still sharp in the earth. The altar, once bare, was stained with blood so recent it had yet to fully dry. It was the message, however, that unsettled him most. Carved into the very stone floor, in uneven Latin script, were the chilling words, "The Devil's Choir sings again." Penrose admitted that he and his colleagues had taken the warning lightly at first, dismissing it as the work of vandals or local mischief makers. Yet by the following morning, 2 of his fellow historians had vanished without a trace, leaving only their coats and lanterns, as if they had simply melted into the air. The absence of those men, both level-headed scholars with little patience for ghost stories, had left Penrose profoundly shaken. Their personal effects had been found arranged in a disturbingly deliberate fashion, as if some invisible hand had preserved them as relics themselves. There were no signs of struggle, no cries heard in the night, only the cold echo of their absence. Even then Penrose had resisted panic, assuming some rational explanation would soon emerge. But when no trace of his companions appeared, no telegram, no hurried note, his composure fractured. His work turned frantic, his hands trembling over every page of Latin text and medieval manuscript, hoping to uncover some historical precedent that could explain the cathedral's dark reputation. It was fear, he confessed, that had driven him at last to Baker Street, fear of what he had seen beneath the altar, and fear of what might follow him home. Throughout Penrose's tale, I observed Holmes closely. Where I felt a creeping discomfort, Holmes displayed only that peculiar glint of amusement that so often accompanied his finest cases. It was not a cruel amusement, but rather the satisfaction of a mind presented with a puzzle draped in shadow, inviting the light of his reason to pierce through. His fingers steepled once more, Holmes allowed Penrose to finish without interruption. Then, without so much as a flicker of doubt or hesitation, Holmes's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, as though the first layer of this mystery had already been peeled away. Holmes's first question was not about the vanished men or the blood-streaked altar, but about Penrose himself. Without awaiting a reply, Holmes began his dissection of the man before us. "The ink upon your right thumb," he said, "betrays your recent struggle with an especially ancient text, one translated in haste, judging by the smudge across your cuff. The scratches along your wrist suggest a confrontation, not with another man, but rather with stone or wood, possibly a concealed panel prized open. And the faint scent of charred paper that clings to your coat, Mr. Penrose, indicates that whatever you uncovered, you found cause to destroy." Penrose flinched at each observation, as though Holmes's deductions struck him like blows from a cane. By the time Holmes fell silent, the historian's hands were trembling anew, though now, from the unsettling awareness that his secrets lay bare before the great detective, Holmes rose from his chair, his movements brisk and filled with purpose, as though the case had already taken hold of him entirely. "You will remain in London for the night, Mr. Penrose," he said. "Watson and I shall accompany you to Canterbury on the first train tomorrow." Then you believe me?" Penrose stammered. "I believe," Holmes said coolly, "that something very real has occurred within the walls of the Black Cathedral, though I would stake my reputation that the devil himself had no hand in it." Penrose seemed scarcely reassured, but I knew Holmes well enough to understand that this was his way of showing genuine interest. For Holmes, The greater the air of the inexplicable, the more irresistible the challenge. As our guest took his leave, Holmes turned to me with that familiar spark in his eye, the one I had seen before the Hound of the Baskervilles case, and again in the matter of the Sussex vampire. "There is," Holmes said quietly, "nothing quite so fascinating as a man undone by his own imagination, except perhaps a man who uses fear itself as a murder weapon." I could not help but shudder. For all my admiration of Holmes's brilliant detachment, there were moments, and this was one of them, when I dearly wished my friend had just a touch more imagination of his own. The following morning, we departed Baker Street under a sky the colour of tarnished pewter, the mist curling around the passing hansoms like a living thing. Holmes was unusually silent, though his sharp profile was half buried behind a book so ancient it shed dust each time the pages turned. "Ecclesiastical Architecture of Kent," he remarked, without looking up. "A tedious work, Watson, save for the fact that the Black Cathedral receives precisely one paragraph, a paragraph which omits nearly every detail of importance." I glanced at his luggage and noted a smaller valise, which I knew to contain a selection of Holmes's more peculiar instruments, a measuring tape, several files, and a delicate magnifying lens. Whatever awaited us in Canterbury, Holmes had already decided that the devil himself could not manufacture a haunting without leaving footprints. As the train creaked and shuddered its way through the countryside, Holmes continued to read aloud, his tone utterly devoid of the awe or reverence such stories might evoke in other men. "The cathedral," he said, "was consecrated in 1438 and served Canterbury's lesser clergy until its closure in 1795. Its original choir was disbanded abruptly after what is euphemistically described as an incident during Vespers. No further explanation is offered." He turned the page. "In 1811, its last appointed caretaker, a Bishop Sedgwick, vanished entirely, leaving behind only his cassock and a torn page from the apocryphal Cantus Tenebris, a work banned even by Rome itself." I could not suppress a shiver. Holmes, seeing my discomfort, smiled faintly. "Fear not, Watson. If ghosts exist, they are remarkably bad at leaving material clues. Let us attend instead to men. They are far better at both deception and disappearance." The cathedral stood apart from the city proper, rising from the mist like the skeleton of some vast creature abandoned by time itself. Its blackened stones seemed to absorb the weak daylight, and ivy had wrapped itself around the crumbling tower as if nature itself wished to drag the structure into the earth. Holmes regarded the building without a word, but I knew the gleam in his eye. This was not simply a ruin. It was a story Holmes intended to read from the very stones. "Come, Watson," he said at last. "I fear we have little time to waste. Superstition is an admirable cover for crime, but it has the unfortunate side effect of removing one's witnesses." Inside the cathedral, the air was heavy with centuries of disuse. My own boots stirred faint clouds of dust with each step, but Holmes moved with the delicate precision of a man dancing between footprints only he could see. "Notice, Watson," he said, pointing at a row of extinguished candles along the altar rail. "These have been displaced. A hand trembled as it placed them, and the wax at the base is still soft. Our visitor was here no more than 2 nights ago." He crouched beside a flagstone, running his fingers along its edge. "The mortar is new, and the scuff here suggests something was dragged into place. A slab, perhaps, covering a hollow space below." I opened my mouth to ask how he knew, but Holmes held up a hand. "There are 4 distinct footprints, each leading to and from the altar. One pair belongs to Penrose. His left boot has a broken heel. The second, however, is lighter, narrower, a woman's step, unless I am very much mistaken." I could only marvel once again at the ease with which Holmes read the world. Where I saw only dust and shadows, he saw a conversation between the living and the dead. It was Holmes who first noticed the fresh inscription, etched crudely along the altar's weathered edge. The stone itself was worn smooth by centuries of damp air, but the letters, harsh, angular, and hurried, stood out with chilling clarity. Qui claves aperit, audit ultimum carmen. Holmes translated aloud. He who unlocks the choir shall hear its final hymn. His tone was one of detached amusement, as though he were reciting the punchline of some particularly obscure joke. Curious, is it not? Holmes said, tracing the letters with his gloved fingertip. We are to believe, presumably, that a hymn can be so terrible that the mere act of hearing it marks the listener for doom. I could not help but glance toward the vaulted ceiling, as though expecting some spectral choir to materialize above us. Holmes, however, showed no such concern. A superstition, he said, or rather, a remarkably convenient threat, well suited to dissuade the prying hands of curious scholars. Holmes stood back from the altar, surveying the nave with the air of a man who had already solved most of the puzzle, but was content to let the game play out a little longer. You see, Watson, he said, the brilliance lies not in the supernatural itself, but in the belief that it exists. These historians were not spirited away by some spectral choir. They were frightened into flight, perhaps even driven to turn upon one another, by the carefully curated legend of this place. I asked whether Holmes believed such fear could truly account for the disappearance of two grown men. Fear, my dear Watson, Holmes said, is a weapon sharper than any dagger, and unlike a blade, it leaves no fingerprints. Near the rear pew, among a scattering of rain-darkened coats left in hasty retreat, Holmes stooped and extracted a single folded slip of paper. It had been torn unevenly, as though snatched from a larger sheet in great haste. Holmes opened it, and though the ink was smudged, the words were still legible enough to draw a low whistle from his lips. Cantus Tenebris. I knew the name only vaguely, from passing mentions in obscure texts. A manuscript so notorious for the curses associated with its verses that even the most rational scholars spoke of it in hushed tones. It appears, said Holmes, that our vanished historians were not here simply to catalogue relics. They were treasure hunters, hoping to lay hands upon the most infamous composition never sung. As the weight of the discovery settled over me, I found my imagination all too eager to fill the shadows around us with phantom voices. Holmes, by contrast, stood at the altar with the faintest smile curling his lips. Not the smile of a man dismissing superstition, but rather the smile of one who saw a human mind at work behind the veil of legend. The most successful ghost stories, Watson, he said, are written not by spirits, but by those who stand to profit from fear. He turned briskly toward the door, leaving me no time to dwell upon the remark. Come, he said, the choir awaits, but it is not the dead who will be singing. Holmes dropped to one knee before the altar, his fingers tracing the fine seam where stone met stone. There was none of his usual commentary for my benefit. The moment had drawn him into that rare state of total concentration when even his own brilliance seemed secondary to the puzzle at hand. He withdrew his pocket-knife and, with the gentlest pressure, eased it along the join. A sharp click broke the silence, and with it came a slight shift in the altar stone itself, as though some ancient breath had been released from within the floor. Watson, Holmes said softly, this altar was never intended for prayer. It is a door, and one that requires not only the hand of man to open, but the voice of faith. At his command, I assisted in lifting the slab, revealing a dark recess beneath. There, shrouded in dust and the heavy scent of earth, lay a mechanism of brass and wood, both alarmingly crude and ingeniously clever, as though built by a mind suspended between devotion and desperation. Holmes ran his fingers across the device, his brow furrowed in the rare expression I recognized as genuine admiration. The mechanism was a confusion of gears and levers, none of which seemed to serve any immediately logical purpose. A slender brass pipe, corroded but intact, led upward into the body of the altar itself. It is a key, Watson, Holmes said, but not a key in the conventional sense. He tapped the pipe lightly. This requires a specific vocal incantation, a spoken phrase or perhaps even a musical note to release the internal latch. But surely, I protested, such a design borders on the absurd. Who would construct so complex a mechanism for something as simple as opening a floor? The faithful, Holmes replied, or those who needed their faith to become fear in the minds of others. Religion and superstition are close cousins, my dear Watson, and here they have built a lock only belief could open. I was still grappling with the bizarre complexity of the device when Holmes, without so much as a glance toward me, said, "You understand, of course, that Penrose lied to us." I started. Lied? But why? "Consider, Watson," Holmes interrupted. The trembling hands, the anxious gaze, the half-truths poorly disguised as omission. Penrose was never a mere historian. He and his associates came not to preserve history, but to plunder it. "The cantus tenebris," I murmured. "Precisely." Holmes rose, brushing the dust from his knees. "There is no innocent academic pursuit in the Black Cathedral. The men who entered these walls sought not relics, but a legend, one they hoped to translate into fame, fortune, or both. Their archaeological interest was nothing more than a veil for greed." I could not help but recall Penrose's description of his vanished colleagues. Men of letters, hardly the sort to vanish into thin air without cause. Holmes, however, saw further than I ever could. "Greed," Holmes said, "is a most reliable accomplice to betrayal. Of the 3 men who entered this cathedral, one believed he needed no partners to claim the prize. But surely, I objected, no man would commit murder over a mere manuscript, however legendary." Holmes's smile was thin. "You underestimate both the power of belief and the seduction of rarity. To certain minds, a forbidden manuscript is no different than buried treasure. When the first man began to waver, perhaps deciding to alert the authorities, the second man struck. A sudden disappearance, whispered ghosts, and the third man fled in fear. Penrose, I said. Indeed, Penrose fled to us, but not to solve the mystery. No, Watson. He fled because, for all his treachery, he feared the Black Cathedral had punished them after all. For a moment, the silence within that ancient space felt almost sentient, as though the stones themselves were listening. Holmes, however, showed no trace of hesitation. He stood, dusted off his hands, and said briskly, "Let us find the final hymn, and with it, the murderer." Holmes led me into a side chamber, where a crumbling cabinet leaned precariously against the wall. Its shelves were heavy with ledgers so ancient that the ink had begun to bleed into the paper like veins beneath translucent skin. Holmes flipped through them with practiced efficiency, his gaze darting from page to page while my own eyes struggled to follow the faded script. "Here, Watson," he said, tapping a particular entry. "The Cathedral Choir of 1794, the year before the sudden closure. Note the annotations beside each name." I peered over his shoulder and saw the chilling words written beside no fewer than 12 names. Damnatus est. Condemned, Holmes translated. It would appear the final choir believed themselves cursed, that their voices, raised in praise, would instead summon death itself. He flipped further, revealing records that extended decades beyond the choir's disbandment, records of marriages, births, and deaths, all traced back to those original 12 singers. Their descendants, Holmes said, formed a secret sect, guardians not of faith, but of fear. They believed the curse was real, and their only duty was to prevent anyone from ever unlocking the final hymn. "Good heavens, Holmes," I muttered. "You mean to say they've been protecting a ghost story for over a century?" "Not protecting, Watson," he corrected. "Weaponizing." As Holmes closed the ledger, his smile was faint but unmistakable. "You see, Watson, it is the perfect scheme, a legend so well cultivated, so firmly rooted in fear, that it requires no further embellishment. The mere mention of the cursed choir is enough to turn even a rational scholar into a trembling wreck." He paced the small chamber, fingers steepled before him. For generations, the descendants of that choir drove away the curious. But this time, the intruders did not come seeking ghosts. They came hunting the Cantus Tenebris. And the sect, fearing exposure, decided to take more drastic measures, I said, following his reasoning. Holmes inclined his head. Exactly. The scholars were not merely frightened off. They were removed. One man betrayed the others, but the fear that had been nurtured for a century made it all the easier. In their minds the curse became real, and fear did the sect's work for them. I shuddered. Holmes, are you saying we are not merely facing a murderer, but an entire sect willing to kill to preserve their secret? Quite so, said Holmes, with what I could only describe as professional satisfaction. For a moment, Holmes stood perfectly still, his eyes half closed, his expression that curious blend of detachment and fierce calculation I had seen only in his most dangerous cases. Watson, he said at last, you will forgive me if I do not reveal everything I have deduced thus far. I started. But surely— Trust me in this, Holmes interrupted. What remains to be done requires not only evidence, but theatre. If we are to draw the villain and the sect from their hiding places, we must give them exactly what they fear most. He turned back toward the nave, leaving me brimming with questions and no answers. You see, Watson, he said over his shoulder, the greatest weapon in this cathedral is not a dagger or a noose, it is the last verse of the hymn, and it is that verse we shall now perform. Holmes stood before the ancient organ, his fingers brushing the keys as though greeting an old adversary. Dust rose at his touch, and I saw in his face a peculiar grimness I could not fully comprehend. The only way, he said quietly, to flush out both the sect and our murderer is to summon the choir, not in spirit, but in sound. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. You mean to say we must play the cursed hymn? Indeed, Holmes replied, for nothing terrifies the guilty so thoroughly as their own myth made real. He struck a single note, and in the silence that followed, I could almost imagine the shadows themselves drawing closer. Come, Watson, Holmes said, let us turn superstition into a confession. Holmes allowed no time for deliberation. The moment the mechanism beneath the altar was understood, he sent a telegram summoning both the remaining members of Penrose's team and the local constabulary to gather within the cathedral at the stroke of midnight. When I questioned the necessity of such a theatrical gathering, Holmes merely offered one of his cryptic smiles and said, If one wishes to trap a ghost, Watson, one must summon the whole séance. The invitation, however, was no mere flourish. Holmes knew the guilty party, whoever had orchestrated the disappearances, would be unable to resist such a spectacle. Fear, Holmes said, compels the superstitious to flee, but it draws in the guilty like moths to a flame. Terrified, they have left some thread for me to pull. There was no argument to be made. By the time the mist had settled upon Canterbury, we stood once more within the darkened nave, awaiting the arrival of both the curious and the guilty. Holmes took his place at the ancient organ, his long fingers caressing the keys with the delicacy of a violinist tuning his strings. The gathered men, Penrose, a trembling churchwarden, a constable who muttered prayers under his breath, stood in uneasy silence beneath the vaulting stones. Gentlemen, Holmes said quietly, you are about to hear a hymn which has not touched mortal ears in over a century. I trust you will forgive any imperfections in my performance. I felt a cold prickle at the base of my neck as the first low, mournful chord filled the air. The sound was neither harmonious nor dissonant. Rather, it carried the peculiar quality of something half-remembered, as if the stone itself hummed along in recognition. Holmes played on, his expression unmoved, though his eyes flicked occasionally toward the shadows beyond the altar. I knew him too well to mistake this for simple caution. He was not playing for the living audience, but for the ghost he meant to summon. I could not help but wonder, if Holmes truly meant to conjure only a criminal, why did his fingers tremble, just once, upon the final chord. The final notes lingered like mist in the air, and for a moment silence reigned. Then, from the far corner of the nave, a faint scuff of leather upon stone echoed toward us. Holmes did not look up from the keys. "Our guest has arrived," he said softly. From the gloom emerged a figure, tall, stooped, and wrapped in a scholar's cloak that had seen better days. The face was hidden, the step hesitant, but the intention was clear, the guilty mind returning to the scene of the crime. "Who's there?" demanded the constable, though his voice lacked conviction. The figure faltered, but did not retreat. Instead, it drew closer, one hand raised in trembling supplication, the other clutching something I could not yet see. Holmes rose from the organ bench, his voice calm and precise. "The man who believes he alone holds the key to unlocking death itself. Welcome back, Professor Allardyce." The figure froze. Then at last, the hood fell back, revealing the pale, haggard face of the missing professor. A face haunted not by ghosts, but by his own obsession. Allardyce's hands shook violently, but his eyes burned with a terrible, almost religious fervour. His hair was wild, his collar askew, and there was a smear of dried blood upon one cuff. The blood, no doubt, of a fellow historian who had stood in his way. "You do not understand," Allardyce whispered. "The manuscript, it is no forgery. The hymn opens a door no living man should enter, and yet I had no choice." "On the contrary," Holmes interrupted, his tone as dry as dust. "You had a great many choices, Professor. You chose to murder your colleagues when they discovered your obsession had crossed from scholarship into madness." Allardyce's face contorted in something between grief and rage. They were weak. They would have turned back, left the greatest discovery in ecclesiastical history to rot beneath this stone. "And so," Holmes said, stepping forward, "you ensured they vanished, one by the knife, the other driven out into the night to be claimed by fear itself. All the while, you told yourself you were preserving knowledge, when in truth, you were preserving your own delusion." The professor's trembling intensified, his fingers curling into fists. But before he could speak again, Holmes raised one hand, his gaze sharp as steel. "It ends tonight, Professor. The choir has sung its last." Without warning, Allardyce produced a revolver from beneath his cloak, a relic of an earlier age, its barrel rusted but its intent unmistakably clear. With a wild glint in his eye, he motioned for us to move toward the altar. Holmes offered neither resistance nor commentary, walking calmly as though the entire affair were an unfolding experiment in human folly. "You've seen too much," Allardyce hissed. "The hymn is not a myth. It is a key to awakening the power beneath this place. You cannot be allowed to leave." Holmes glanced back at me, his expression almost pitying, though whether the pity was for me or for Allardyce, I could not say. Together we lifted the altar stone once more, revealing the narrow staircase plunging into darkness below. "After you, gentlemen," Allardyce said. With the barrel of his revolver pressed to my back, I descended, Holmes at my side. The air grew colder with each step, the dampness settling in my lungs like a tangible weight. Allardyce followed, muttering half-formed Latin phrases under his breath, words that had no power except the power he had given them in his mind. The crypt was smaller than I had expected, its floor uneven and strewn with ancient debris. Allardyce moved quickly to the far wall, where a secondary mechanism was concealed beneath a broken plaque. Holmes, his arms folded, watched the professor with the air of a tutor indulging a particularly dull pupil. "You do not understand," Allardyce said, his voice trembling with ecstasy and terror in equal measure. "The hymn was only the first step. The final verse requires a sacrifice. The cathedral itself demands blood." With a final twist of the mechanism, the altar stone above began to grind shut, locking us within the crypt. The sound was hideous, ancient stone scraping against ancient stone, as though the earth itself wished to consume us whole. Watson, to his credit, kept his composure, but I confess my own heart pounded like a drum, for it seemed Holmes had, at last, been caught by forces neither logic nor deduction could escape. Holmes, however, stood perfectly still, a faint smile curling his lips, as though this were the precise outcome he had anticipated from the very start. There came a sudden metallic shriek, followed by a loud snap, and the grinding stone froze halfway through its descent. Allardyce's triumphant expression collapsed into bewilderment. "It would appear, Professor," said Holmes, "that your beloved mechanism has suffered an unfortunate accident." Holmes stepped forward and, with a flourish, withdrew a small brass pin from his pocket. "While you were delivering your soliloquy upstairs, I took the liberty of removing this essential cog, a precaution, you see, in case your zeal overcame your common sense." Allardyce lunged at Holmes, but Holmes sidestepped with effortless grace, leaving the professor to stumble against the wall. "It is a curious thing, Watson," Holmes continued. "How often the greatest believers in the supernatural are those who most actively manufacture its effects." The constabulary, summoned by Holmes's prearranged signal, descended the stairs, their lanterns casting trembling light across the scene. "Take him," Holmes said simply, as though ordering a cup of tea. Our professor's hymn is at an end. As Allardyce was led, cursing and raving, up the stairs, Holmes turned to me with that rare air of philosophical amusement he reserved for cases where human folly outpaced human wickedness. "The Cantus Tenebris," he said, "was no more authentic than a playbill for a penny theatre. It was fabricated in the 17th century, a clever forgery, intended to frighten superstitious thieves from plundering the cathedral's lesser relics." "But the curse, the disappearances," I began. "Ah, Watson," said Holmes, "there lies the brilliance of fear itself. The manuscript became infamous because people needed it to be infamous. It grew into legend not through fact, but through repetition, until even the men who came to debunk it found themselves ensnared." Allardyce, Holmes explained, had been drawn into the legend through his own ambition. He wanted the manuscript not for knowledge, but for the prestige of solving the unsolvable. When his colleagues refused to indulge his obsession, he removed them, yet in doing so, he convinced even himself that the curse was real. "In short," Holmes concluded, "the true ghost in this cathedral was the ghost of human folly." As we stepped once more into the damp night air, the distant bells of Canterbury chimed the hour. Holmes paused on the path, his gaze turned toward the dark silhouette of the black cathedral. "Do you believe in curses, Holmes?" I asked. He lit a cigarette, the ember flaring briefly against the mist. "My dear Watson," he said, "I believe in the remarkable power of fear to make men see precisely what they expect to see." The constables led Allardyce away, his head bowed, his lips still muttering broken verses. Holmes watched him with something close to pity, though I knew better than to expect sentimentality from him. "This case," Holmes said, "will serve as a textbook example for some future criminologist, not for its supernatural intrigue, but as proof that a well-placed legend can kill as surely as any bullet." He turned briskly, his coat flaring slightly as he walked. "Come, Watson," he said. "I have a monograph to write on the criminal applications of ecclesiastical folklore. Perhaps, for once, Scotland Yard will learn something." And so we left the Black Cathedral behind, its curse unmasked, its secrets laid bare, and its final hymn sung not by ghostly voices, but by the cold, clear voice of reason itself. 2 nights after our return from Canterbury, I found myself once more ensconced in my familiar chair at Baker Street, the rain tapping a steady rhythm against the windows, while the comforting glow of the hearth cast elongated shadows upon the walls. Holmes sat opposite me, a faint wisp of smoke rising from the long stem of his pipe. His gaze turned toward the ceiling as though tracing unseen constellations of deduction in the air above. "Well, Watson," he said at last, "it is rare that we are presented with a case so thoroughly wrapped in its own legend, and rarer still that the legend proves more formidable than the crime itself." He stretched his legs toward the fire, his expression one of languid satisfaction. "Let us reconstruct the affair, not for the benefit of posterity, but more for the education of one John H. Watson, M.D., who remains, despite many years of my association, incurably vulnerable to the charms of ghost stories. Despite the warmth of the room, I felt a faint chill at the memory of the midnight hymn and the crumbling walls of the Black Cathedral. Holmes, however, regarded the matter as nothing more than a particularly amusing lecture demonstration, and I knew well enough to expect no allowances for sentimentality. Holmes began, as always, with the first and simplest observation, the detail which to my eyes had seemed insignificant at the time, but which had provided him with the key to the entire affair. The fear, Holmes said, was too well defined. I frowned. I should think any rational man would feel uneasy in such surroundings. Precisely, said Holmes. Rational fear is vague, a general unease at dark corners and creaking floors. But the fear shown by Penrose and his colleagues was specific. They spoke not merely of ghosts, but of the cursed choir, of a particular hymn, of a singularly defined threat. Such precision in fear is not the product of imagination, Watson. It is taught. He leaned forward, the firelight reflecting in his sharp eyes. The legend had been curated, passed down like a family heirloom, until it ceased to be merely a story and became a tool, a method by which the cathedral could be kept undisturbed by curious hands. It was not a haunting, Watson. It was a campaign of psychological intimidation, maintained for over a century. Now, Holmes continued, the true brilliance of the scheme lies not in the legend itself, but in its effect upon the minds of men. He tapped the bowl of his pipe against the grate, sending a shower of embers into the fire. Consider our vanished historians. They arrived as colleagues, united by a common goal, the discovery of the Cantus Tenebris, but the legend, once fully absorbed, turned them into rivals. The moment they believed the manuscript might be real, greed took hold, Holmes explained. Each man, suddenly convinced that the prize belonged to him alone, began to suspect the others. In that atmosphere of suspicion, it took only the gentlest nudge, perhaps a whisper in the dark, or the echo of their own footsteps mistaken for spectral voices, to tip the first man into betrayal. One was murdered, Holmes said with chilling calm. The other fled, believing himself pursued by either a ghost or his own guilt. By the time Penrose reached Baker Street, the cathedral's legend had done most of the work for us, leaving only the task of disentangling fact from fiction. And what of the singing itself? I asked. That eerie melody. Surely you do not mean to suggest it was entirely imaginary? Holmes smiled, the sort of smile which, in our long friendship, I had come to associate with the imminent delivery of a scientific revelation. The human ear, my dear Watson, is a most impressionable organ, particularly when confronted with silence broken only by random ambient noise. The Black Cathedral, owing to centuries of water damage and uneven settling, had become a vast accidental resonator. He gestured toward his violin case. Strike a single note upon the organ, and the stones themselves sing it back, but disjointed, fragmented, distorted into something more akin to a whispered chant than a coherent melody. In short, Holmes said, there was no choir. There was only the choir-shaped hole in the imagination of every man who entered that nave, waiting to be filled by the creak of timber, the whisper of wind, or the sigh of a breath caught and carried by ancient stone. He settled back into his chair, the case now laid bare. Thus, fear gave birth to legend, legend gave birth to madness, and madness gave birth to murder, all within the space of a single ancient hymn no one ever truly sang. Holmes knocked the ash from his pipe, his fingers tracing idle patterns upon the arm of his chair. You see, Watson, he began, the Cantus Tenebris is a testament not to the power of the supernatural, but to the endurance of a well-crafted lie. It began, he continued, as nothing more than a clever fabrication, a medieval scribe, perhaps instructed by a particularly imaginative abbot, forging a forbidden manuscript designed to frighten off grave robbers and curious monks. But something remarkable occurred. The forgery took root. It passed from whisper to whisper, gaining weight and consequence with each retelling, until it was no longer a mere deterrent, It became, he said, a living myth, nurtured not by its creators, but by those who came after, each generation adding its own layer of embellishment, until fear itself became the most enduring relic within those walls. I shook my head in wonder. So a lie became history, and history became a curse. Holmes smiled faintly. Quite so. In all my years of practice, I have rarely encountered a crime committed by the long dead. But crimes committed in their name. Now, Watson, that is a different matter entirely. Holmes relit his pipe, the flare briefly illuminating the sharp angles of his face. And so we come to Professor Gideon Allardyce, he said. A man of letters, a scholar of reputation. And yet, for all his education, he became the final victim of the very legend he sought to exploit. He gestured toward the window, where the rain ran in crooked veins down the glass. It is a peculiar trait of the human mind, Watson. The more one invests in a deception, the more one begins to believe it oneself. Allardyce began this affair as a fraudulent treasure hunter, seeking a manuscript he knew to be mythical. But the deeper he dug, the more real it became in his own imagination. He surrounded himself with the legend until he could no longer see where fact ended and fiction began. The curse became his truth, and once his colleagues stood in the way of that truth, they ceased to be colleagues. They became, in his mind, the necessary sacrifice to complete the legend. I shuddered at the thought. So the man became both villain and victim. Precisely, said Holmes, and a cautionary tale to all those who confuse scholarship with superstition. Holmes leaned back, folding his hands before him, his gaze momentarily drifting into the middle distance. This, Watson, he said, was never a case about murder alone. It was a case about belief, and the terrifying power it holds over rational men. He turned toward me, his eyes gleaming with the particular sharpness I knew from our most fascinating cases. What drove Allardyce to murder was not greed alone, but certainty. The certainty that the legend was true, that the choir's curse was real, and that only through blood could the final verse be sung. Men will lie for money, Watson. They will steal for reputation. But they will kill for belief, for the absolute conviction that they are right. The rain had eased, the fire reduced to a gentle glow, but the weight of Holmes's words settled heavily in the room. Superstition, Holmes said, is the oldest accomplice to crime. For when a man believes the heavens themselves sanction his deeds, there is no law he will not break. I scribbled furiously in my notebook, knowing I would never capture the full force of Holmes's insight, but determined to preserve what I could. There was a pause, during which I gathered my thoughts and Holmes replenished his pipe. At last, unable to resist, I asked, Holmes, during all our time in the Black Cathedral, with the echoing hymn and the vanished men, did you never feel even a flicker of doubt? Did the thought of a genuine haunting never cross your mind? Holmes gave me a look of such profound amusement that I immediately regretted the question. Yet, there was something else in his expression, a flicker of warmth perhaps, or the slightest hint of indulgence toward an old friend's failing imagination. My dear Watson, he said at last, ghosts are merely the footprints left by the unimaginative. I laughed despite myself, for it was pure Holmes, dismissive, elegant, and perfectly cutting. And yet, he added after a pause, it is not the ghosts themselves that concern me. It is the men who invent them, and what they are willing to do in their name. With that, he rose, stretched, and reached for his violin. The conversation was over, the case closed. Outside, the rain continued its soft percussion against the glass. No spectral choirs, no cursed hymns, just the unremarkable rhythm of London itself. And thus concluded the adventure of the Black Cathedral, a case of shadows and superstition, solved not by banishing ghosts, but by exposing the fearful minds that created them. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing softly, when Holmes and I settled into our customary places at Baker Street. The rain, which had followed us all the way from Canterbury, now traced delicate patterns upon the window pane, as though London itself wished to offer its own reflection upon our latest adventure. Between us stood the decanter of brandy, a small luxury Holmes permitted after cases that, in his words, demonstrated the inexhaustible folly of mankind. He filled both our glasses, though his own remained untouched, his long fingers drumming absently upon the arm of his chair. The Black Cathedral affair was officially concluded, its villain apprehended, its mystery unravelled. And yet, Holmes wore the expression I had come to recognize, not the triumphant satisfaction of victory, but the restlessness of a mind already reaching toward the next puzzle. For several minutes, we sat in companionable silence. Then, unable to suppress my curiosity, I remarked, "You seem unusually thoughtful tonight, Holmes. One might almost suspect this case has troubled you." Holmes gave a slight smile, but his gaze remained fixed upon the fire. "Not troubled, Watson," he replied, "but intrigued. Cases involving fear itself are always the most instructive. Fear," he continued, "is a curious creature. It requires no evidence, no proof. It thrives in absence, the absence of knowledge, the absence of light, the absence of reason. Once allowed entry, it will build a fortress upon shadows, and from that fortress it will govern even the most rational mind. Which," he concluded, "makes it a far more dangerous adversary than any criminal we have ever faced." Holmes leaned forward, the fingers of one hand steepled, while the other tapped softly against his knee. "Consider, Watson, the curious inversion at the heart of this case. The belief itself became the evidence. The absence of explanation became proof of the supernatural. The very lack of reason was taken as the strongest reason of all." He shook his head with a wry amusement. "Once a man decides to believe in a ghost, every creaking floorboard becomes a whisper from the beyond. Every cold draught becomes a spectral breath. Rational thought surrenders its crown, and imagination ascends the throne. Men, my dear Watson, do not fear what they know. They fear what they have convinced themselves must be true, and no evidence, however plain, can stand against a story they have already told themselves." I could not help but ask, "Holmes, after all this, after the hymn, the crypt, the singing stones, do you still maintain that there are no supernatural forces at work in this world?" Holmes's smile sharpened into one of his rare and perfectly honed epigrams. "My dear Watson," he said, "I have yet to meet a ghost who could hold a candle to human greed." With that, he reached for his violin, as though to serenade the very absurdity of the human condition. Before the first note could be drawn, there came a firm knock at the door, followed by the unmistakable tread of Mrs. Hudson. She entered, bearing a silver tray, upon which lay a folded telegram. Holmes took it without ceremony, unfolding it with a flick of his wrist. His eyes flicked over its contents, and I saw, unmistakably, that glint, the gleam of a hunter who has just sighted his next quarry. "Another case?" I asked, already rising. "Indeed, Watson," said Holmes, his smile growing. "It appears we are summoned to investigate a disappearance on the Norfolk coast. A gentleman who, curiously enough, was last seen entering a house that no longer exists." He stood, reaching for his coat. "Come, Watson, the game is afoot once more." And with that, we stepped into the London night, two souls forever in pursuit of truth, whether in the light of reason or the shadows cast by human fear. As we settled back into our chairs at Baker Street, the fire casting a gentle glow upon the familiar room, Holmes rested his fingertips together and allowed himself one of those rare reflective pauses that signaled the true end of a case. "Fear, Watson," he said at last, "is the most efficient accomplice ever devised. It requires no payment, leaves no fingerprints, and confesses nothing. And yet, it can drive a man to murder his friends, believe his own lies, and ultimately trap himself inside the very story he invented." I considered this in silence, thinking of Professor Allardyce, A man so blinded by his own need to believe that he became both the author and the victim of his own tragedy. And all because of a forgery, I added quietly. Indeed, said Holmes with a faint smile. It would seem, my dear Watson, that the most dangerous ghost of all is the one we summon from our own imagination. Holmes turned his gaze toward the window, where the London rain still whispered against the glass. Which raises an interesting question for you, Watson, and for anyone with a taste for deduction. He glanced toward me, his eyes gleaming with that familiar mischief. In your opinion, Watson, what was Professor Allardyce's greatest mistake? Was it his belief in the supernatural, his mistrust of his colleagues, or something far subtler, hidden in plain sight? I invite you, fellow seekers of logic and lovers of mystery, to share your own deductions. What do you believe was the fatal flaw that unraveled the professor's plan? Leave your reasoning in the comments below, and if you wish to join us on future adventures, be sure to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes mysteries. And if you have a friend who enjoys a tale of fear, greed, and clever deception, share this story with them. For every mystery is best enjoyed in good company.